Everyone loves to talk about Walter White's ego, his pride, his mistakes, his dissent. But somehow, Mike Ehrmantraut, yes, the same man who spent years as a corrupt cop and later enforced for a drug kingpin, gets talked about like he's the franchise's moral compass. The quiet professional, the man with a code, the one who only goes after people in the game. The fans treat him like he's the adult in the room. But here's the question no one likes asking. If Mike was such a moral anchor, why does his record look almost identical to the man he condemned? Because when you dig into the timeline, something strange happens. The legendary code starts to crumble. The noble, I did it for my family narrative starts to look suspiciously self-serving. And the calm, gravel-voiced moral lectures? Well, they seem a lot less profound when you remember he stood loyally beside Gus Fring, while Gus was threatening to murder a baby. Yet somehow, the fandom insists that Walt destroyed Gus's operation out of ego, while Mike apparently just floated through the criminal world as a reluctant angel doing noble deeds. So today, we're pulling the curtain back. Because if Mike Ehrmantraut wants to call Walter White a hypocrite, he might want to take a long, hard look in the mirror first. Walter White, it seems, enjoys a permanent lease inside the collective imagination, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the persistent insistence that Mike Ehrmantraut won his final argument with him. One hears this claim with such confidence that it apparently no longer requires evidence. Mike raised his voice, delivered his lines with gravelly conviction, and therefore must have been right. This logic, if one can call it that, deserves the same respect one gives to roadside horoscopes. The ostensible argument is simple. Mike asserts that Walt just had to blow up Gus Fring's operation out of pride. The chorus nods along, satisfied that a man calmly cleaning a gun while speaking in a monotone is automatically the moral authority in any given room. But a brief review of the events leading up to Gus Fring's demise reveals that Walt's pride had remarkably little to do with anything. He was busy trying not to be murdered, a task that tends to overshadow ego. The chain reaction began when two of Gus's dealers killed a child, possibly on Gus's instructions, at the very least under his watch. This was not a theoretical inconvenience. It was a moral catastrophe, one that guaranteed Jesse's unhinged retaliation. Walt, understanding that Jesse would be killed long before he completed his revenge mission, eliminated the dealers first. A preemptive strike, yes, but a necessary one. The result? Gus attempted to kill Walt immediately afterward and began grooming Jesse as a replacement. This was not an ego battle between titans. This was an employer attempting to murder his employee, then attempting to murder his family to cut loose a liability. Walt did not suddenly develop a flair for dramatic gestures. He simply refused to watch his brother-in-law be assassinated and his wife and children slaughtered. Yet Mike's indictment of Walt's pride has been elevated to something resembling scripture. The fact that Mike himself admired Gus to the point of delusion is quietly ignored. He believed, with touching sincerity, that Gus intended to keep Walt on after the infamous box cutter incident. Learn to take yes for an answer, he lectured, serenely unaware that Gus spent the next several months planning Walt's execution. Mike genuinely thought harmony was possible, a sort of criminal domestic bliss, if only Walt would keep the peace. According to this worldview, it was Walt's disruptive presence, not the drug dealers murdering children or the employer threatening entire families, that constituted the real chaos. This selective memory is not limited to Mike. Many adopt Mike's vantage point as if it were the official record. Before Walt, everything was apparently running smoothly, a euphemism for murder, extortion, and the occasional corpse stuffed neatly into industrial machinery. Walt arrived, refused to be killed quietly, and was therefore at fault. Jesse's role in provoking the chain of events is conveniently minimized. His impulsive crusade after Combo's death, his escalating drug use, his reckless decisions, these are trimmed away. The narrative runs on the elegant simplicity of blaming the man who, inconveniently, survived long enough to argue back. Of course, some take the phrase "Walt won the argument because he shot him" quite literally, reducing the entire philosophical dispute to the ballistic conclusion, as if bullets, rather than logic, determine the moral victor. Mike lost the argument because he died. Walt won because he lived an additional 20 minutes. It is a tidy calculus for those uncomfortable distinguishing rhetoric from reality. But the claim that Walt killed Mike solely out of ego is just another fragment of the sentimental mythology surrounding Mike. The idea that his judgment was impartial, his motives noble, and his frustrations righteous. The truth is considerably less flattering. Mike was furious because Walt's existence disrupted his pension plan. Walt did not kill Mike because he felt insulted. He killed him because Mike, in a moment of astonishing carelessness, blamed him for a disaster he did not create and refused information that Walt believed he needed. Both men were wrong, but neither was operating from the lofty philosophical principles that fans nostalgically imagine. Amusingly, whenever the conversation shifts to Mike's own moral code, the reverence only grows. Mike, according to popular lore, is the stoic guardian angel of the franchise, a man who only kills people in the game, a man who does everything for his family, a man whose principles, unlike Walt's, are supposedly pure. This mythology, like most mythology, holds up beautifully until one examines it. Then it collapses. The so-called family man originated as a corrupt cop. His early under-the-table work began with small jobs, occasional intimidation, light security, nothing too dramatic. At first, one could even believe he did these things purely for his struggling daughter-in-law and granddaughter. He declined jobs requiring broken legs. He maintained a boundary. And then he crossed it. The moment he manipulated his way into a larger payout from the cartel, after being threatened, yes, but then pushing for an extra $50,000, he was no longer responding to danger. He was responding to pride. Once the immediate threat to his family passed, he continued to antagonize Hector Salamanca, not as a protective father figure, but as a man unwilling to let an insult go unanswered. He justified it retroactively with money for the family, but it was vengeance dressed as noble sacrifice. The pinnacle of this contradiction appears when he robbed Hector, not because the family needed it, but because he wanted the police investigating Hector, wanted revenge, wanted justice as he defined it. He risked his family's safety for emotional satisfaction. And yet the legend of Saint Mike insists he did everything for his granddaughter, as though his actions were a charity marathon, and not an extended streak of blood-soaked vigilantism. Eventually, he accumulated $250,000, more than enough to support several lifetimes of piano lessons and orthodontic care. At that point, doing anything further in the criminal world was unnecessary. Yet he voluntarily sought Gus Fring to launder the money, a decision that the mythology generously interprets as family protection. He had other options: a sleazy lawyer friend, an underworld veterinarian who specialized in connecting clients to discreet services, an entire roster of low-risk criminals. But he chose the most dangerous employer available. Lydia even clarified that Gus was investing in Mike because he believed Mike to be very good at his job, a clear warning that the favor would require reciprocity. Mike accepted anyway. The deeper he went, the more transparent his motives became. After the Warner disaster, he quit. He had enough money for the family, yet he spiraled into a drunken collapse, as if a moral calling had been stripped away. He accepted Gus's claim that without purpose, specifically the purpose of enforcing violence, he would self-destruct. This is not a portrait of a noble father. It is a portrait of a man who cannot live without the adrenaline of the criminal world. A man who likes the work, excels at the work, and uses his family as a convenient moral alibi. His adherence to a code becomes not a measure of integrity, but a coping mechanism, a way to pretend he is better than the circumstances he voluntarily inhabits. His advice to Jimmy, his famous bad choice road sermon, reveals precisely this delusion. He insisted there is no way off the road once one steps onto it. This is demonstrably false. Characters leave the game. Some run, some hide, some rebuild. Kim Wexler walked away at unimaginable personal cost, but she walked. Mike, however, needed to believe in determinism because determinism excused him. If the road is inevitable, then it is not his fault for continuing along it. Yet Nacho called him out explicitly. Did he understand who he was working for? Mike responded by dodging the point entirely. He warned Nacho of the consequences, yes, but that did not answer why he continued to serve a man capable of horrors he knew in detail. It was easier to invoke a code than admit complicity. The sanctification of his rule about only going after people in the game is another triumph of selective logic. It is an absurd moral justification, a vague membership requirement that turns murder into administrative housekeeping. A person's decision to exist within a criminal economy does not make them less sentient, less complex, less capable of fear, less deserving of life. Many in the game are not monsters like Tuco. They are people like Nacho, like the laundromat manager, like Werner, hardly villains, but casualties of Mike's code. Yet placing them in the category of acceptable targets allows Mike to avoid examining what he does. It also lets the audience feel comfortable admiring him. It is easier to praise a man with a system than acknowledge he is simply efficient at killing. Indeed, the most charitable interpretation of Mike is that he is a cautionary tale, a man who convinced himself he could dip one toe into corruption without being dragged under. The story reveals the lie in that assumption. Loyalty becomes a seductive virtue, then a trap, then a chain. His inability to escape parallels Kim's journey, except she recognized the truth and forced herself out of the spiral. Mike never reached that moment of clarity. Jimmy, for his part, never possessed the introspection necessary to notice the spiral at all. Jesse alone managed to glimpse the moral rot and flee, battered but alive. Yet in the fan imagination, Mike retains an undeserved moral high ground. This conveniently overlooks his willingness to work side by side with a man who plotted to murder a baby. Gus Fring's threat to kill an infant never stopped Mike from showing up to work on time. But Walt is the ego-driven monster. Mike, the conscientious objector. This revisionist portrait also avoids acknowledging the obvious similarities between Walt and Mike. Both are cold, calculating, morally compromised, capable of tenderness when it comforts them, and armed with superiority complexes that justify every decision. The difference is cosmetic. Walt masks his sins beneath theatrical rationalizations. Mike masks them with silence. Walt deceives others. Mike deceives himself. Both contribute to the bloodshed they later condemn. The adoration at times becomes comical. He is hailed as the paragon of strategic competence, yet his mistakes are enormous. Underestimating Walt cost him his life. Underestimating Walt also cost Gus his life, cost Hank his life, and obliterated Jack's entire crew. He relaxed his guard when Walt made a phone call at gunpoint in Season 3, a blunder that would embarrass a rookie officer. He gave away his location to the police in Season 5, forcing him into the frantic escape that ended at the riverbank. His attempts to deposit money under Kaylee's name triggered federal attention multiple times. His reliance on a catastrophically incompetent lawyer compromised everyone he worked with. His habit of insulting Walt long after Walt had demonstrated he was unpredictable, dangerous, and resourceful was the kind of arrogance that usually comes with a warning label. And his decision to work with Walt at all after Walt had already murdered Gus shows that Mike was not the stoic genius he is often portrayed to be. His goal, allegedly, was to provide for Kaylee. Yet his granddaughter did not need millions of dollars. She needed her grandfather alive. Instead, she received a legacy of trauma and confusion. His outburst at her, triggered by the mention of his son, revealed a man who had not processed his grief, had not resolved his guilt, and had not developed the emotional capacity to shepherd his family out of danger. His son's death, the event that defined his moral mythology, was the result of corruption within the police force, a world Mike participated in willingly. His belief that he could morally atone by bankrolling Kaylee's future was noble in intention, but his method ensured she would grow up without him. And yet, despite the litany of failures, Mike's stoic demeanor inspires reverence. His quieter moments, playing the friendly old man in a bookstore, feigning obliviousness while scheming, delivering deadpan quips, are often celebrated as comedic highlights. His presence in scenes becomes a kind of ritual comfort, a reminder that even in a morally bankrupt universe, one can at least look dignified while committing felonies. But this dignity is not morality. It is performance. The camera, generous as always, frames him as composed, calculating, unflinching. It invites admiration, and audiences oblige. The universe surrounding him, however, never pretended he was anything but compromised. Better Call Saul introduced him not as a tragic hero, but as a man already rotting from the inside, whose principles were porous enough to allow whatever violence circumstance demanded. Some argue that his heavy screen time in Better Call Saul renders him overexposed. Once the novelty of his stoicism wears off, one sees an aging enforcer performing repetitive surveillance, brooding silently in cars, carrying out cartel errands with mechanical inevitability. His storyline, at times, wanders. The mystique dissipates. His physical prowess sometimes strains believability, knocking down younger men with alarming ease, as though decades of military and police service confer lifelong superhuman strength. Such artistic liberties are accepted because they preserve the fantasy of Mike, the indestructible, incorruptible operator. But the reality, embedded beneath that fantasy, is more interesting. He is not indestructible. He dies in a muddy clearing, defeated by his own underestimation of a man he dismissed as an amateur. He is not incorruptible. His entire life in New Mexico is an extended apology for a career spent betraying the public trust. He is not selfless. He is addicted to the thrill of competency within darkness. He is not morally superior. He simply dresses his choices in fewer words. Even his introduction to the universe, born of a scheduling conflict, reinforces the accidental nature of his myth-making. He entered the story not as deliberate symbolism, but as a pragmatic production fix. From that contingency grew a character hailed as one of television's most compelling paragons of cold efficiency. That the legend emerged from improvisation only emphasizes how much of his reputation depends on audience interpretation rather than textual fact. Ultimately, the fixation on who won the argument between Walt and Mike reveals more about audience sentiment than about the scene itself. It is easier, comforting even, to believe that Mike represents order, discipline, and moral clarity, while Walt represents chaos, ego, and corruption. But both men participated willingly in the same world. Both escalated its violence. Both lied about their motives. Both fostered destruction that rippled beyond their intentions. The difference is not moral substance, but aesthetic presentation. Walt expresses ego through theatricality. Mike expresses ego through stoicism. Walt demands recognition. Mike demands obedience. Walt uses words. Mike uses silence. Walt is hated for his arrogance. Mike is adored for his restraint. Yet restraint is not virtue, and silence is not innocence. The argument between them, then, is not one of moral philosophy, but of narrative preference. One man's delusion is presented loudly, the other's is presented quietly. One burns down his world, the other watches his world burn and calls it fate. Yet both cling to the belief that they were cornered by circumstance, that they had no choice, that the road was fixed beneath their feet. Both use this belief to excuse what they have done, and both, ultimately, meet ends shaped by their own uncompromising certainties. The tragedy is not that one of them was right. The tragedy is that both believed they were. Subscribe.